I think that we should just get started now. We certainly have a lot to cover in only an hour, and it's a really important and timely topic that we have here today. Again, my name is Katie Sullivan, Managing Director here in partial lockdown Toronto. I'm with IETA, and we have the pleasure of including this event as part of our Carbon Markets Virtual Pavilion program over the course of today and tomorrow, where we're partnering with the International Carbon Action Partnership, or ICAP. Today's event is sponsored by Carbon Finance Lab, a great partner member of IETA's in a lot of our activities around the world. And I have the opportunity here to moderate today's, like I said, it's a timely topic where we'll look at the evolution, the outlooks, some of the enablers for low carbon energy products, offerings, and markets. We're going to hear from really a diverse group of business leaders that are spanning the globe and market experts to really unpack and thread some needles around low carbon product, technology, and market innovations. The goal really for the audience here today when you leave is to just have a better understanding of the key questions around technological removals and associated low carbon energy products, some of the demand, the solutions, the differentiation capabilities and why that matters. So again, this means threading some needles across some fairly big ticket questions like the what, the why, the how, the where, and really what to watch. So again, I'm privileged to be joined by a great set of panelists who will provide some initial interventions and presentations. This includes Patrick Berge, who's co-founder, director of funds and platforms at South Pole. We have Lauren Riley, who is the head of global environment sustainability at United Airlines. Robert Zeller, who is the vice president, technology at Oxy Low Carbon Ventures. Andras Juhas, who's the head of sustainability and corporate social responsibility at Aqua Power. And last but certainly not least, we have Nick Gogarty, who's the managing director at Carbon Finance Labs. So just a quick housekeeping here. With this platform, you will have the opportunity to put your comments, questions into that chat box, the upper right-hand corner. Feel free to do so. Don't be shy over the course of the session, and we'll certainly try to get to as many as possible. And also, please continue to keep yourselves on mute and your videos off for the time being, at least, certainly as we get through some of the core presentations and remarks. So without further ado, I will tee up Patrick, South Pole. And Patrick will provide kind of a stage setter presentation about the state of play around global carbon markets, the trends, the role of removals and really technological removals, and some insights about where this market is and where it could be headed, or how it must evolve over time. So Patrick, your slides are baked in here, and I'll pass the mic over to you.
Thanks a lot, Katie. It's a pleasure to join this panel today. And yeah, as Katie said, my presentation will be a bit of I'll just be setting the stage a little bit and giving some context about some of the trends we see, and talk a little bit about the role of removals. And yeah, and if you could move to the next slide, please. Yeah, so I think for me, one of the big eye openers, looking at developments in carbon markets over the last 2 years, I think the biggest trend that we observe at the moment is this whole transition and talk about net zero. And that goes back to the IPCC report back in 2018, the 1.5 degree report, where I think the IPCC coined this term of net zero for the first time. And basically what they said is, given all the scenarios that science was looking at, in order to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees, we will have to reach net zero emissions around 2050. And what that essentially means is that we will have to start neutralizing unavoidable emissions through negative emissions, which are represented here by the green surface on this graph, around 2050. And I think this is due to the fact that the reduction pathways are delayed. So the decarbonization pathways are getting steeper and steeper. And on top of that, science is also telling us we will also need to go into negative emission territory if we are to achieve the global warming targets. And that's something that is new. It was not as so clear in the past, but this definition of net zero by the IPCC is basically creating a whole new demand for negative emissions or carbon removals within the context of carbon markets. And that's something a distinction we didn't really have in the past. So when we issued carbon credits, we didn't really make a difference between avoided emissions by, for example, renewable energy versus fossil fuel energy, or carbon removals in reforestation projects, for example. If you go to the next slide, please. And yeah, I think this, the wake-up call by science and the IPCC is trickling down now to corporates and climate stewardship of corporates. So we are seeing a lot of net zero commitments emerging from the private sector. I think there are more than 500 B Corps, certified B corporation that already committed to net zero by 2030. There is this Transform to Net Zero Alliance and many others initiative. What's interesting to see is that many of these net zero pledges by corporates already include explicit commitments towards removals, others don't. So I think also corporates are still trying to figure out what net zero really means. And the recent publication by the Science Based Targets initiative that described how corporates can reach net zero, I think is now providing some light into the discussion and helping to harmonize a little bit the thinking and the kind of pledges that are made. Next slide. Yeah, in this slide, I think you see a representation of the most ambitious net zero strategy by the Science Based Targets initiative, also referred to Strategy 5 or the climate positive approach. And this is, I think, a good slide to illustrate how carbon markets are changing. So you see here the business as usual emissions by corporates going up, and efforts that companies have to undertake to reduce emissions in line with science. That would be the blue surface, the dark blue surface. And what corporates have been doing so far was mainly looking backwards to their emissions in the past based on carbon footprints, and then buying offsets, which most cases are about avoided emissions to become climate neutral. So that's, and these avoidance credits are represented here by the green surface. And what the Science-Based Target is now saying is that over time, you need to decarbonize in line with science. So that's, I think, important that we really align with IPCC. And over time, we need to phase in removals so that by 2050, we compensate all the unavoidable emissions with removals. And that's, I think, the best practice definition of the science-based targets. It's this combination of using carbon credits that avoid emissions today, so align with climate neutrality targets, and then over time transitioning to steep reductions and removals only. So that's just to put that into context. And next slide. Yeah, and then when we talk about removals, we see that there is a confusion, and I think we'll hear some concrete examples of projects. And I won't go into too much detail on this slide, but what you see on the upper side is that there are CCS projects and there are CCU projects. And there are different sources of CO2 that we have to look at. So there are fossil fuel sources of CO2, there is biogenic CO2 coming mainly from biomass, and there is atmospheric CO2. And what the IPCC says, and I think this is also endorsed by most buyers that are now procuring removals in the market, is that the definition of removals will evolve around the project types highlighted in green here. So we would be looking only into biogenic sources of CO2 and direct air capture from the atmosphere, which is basically the only way to take CO2 out of the atmosphere in the long run. And things like CCS based on fossil fuel sources of CO2, this would qualify as avoided emissions, but not as a removal. So that's, I think, an important thing to keep in mind. But there is a lot of confusion still in the market. Next slide. And I will end the presentation just with a basic wish list with regards to reforms that we think we need to happen in carbon markets in order to scale up this whole removal space, and also to make sure that we have a credible approach to net zero. So I think the first wish is that, despite this new enthusiasm that we have around carbon removals and also renaissance around carbon credits, that can't replace really steep decarbonization efforts. So that has to remain center stage. Also, this new appetite for removals that we are seeing by corporates should not displace but complement the use of carbon credits that avoid emissions and contribute to sustainable development. One good example here is there is no point in going for reforestation only that removes CO2 from the atmosphere while allowing for deforestation and losing a lot of biodiversity. So that's, I think, important to keep in mind. We need a coherent definition of carbon removals and carbon standards, and some buy-in by buyers. We need carbon standards will have to make an explicit distinction between avoided emissions and carbon removals when issuing carbon credits. That will be important for corporates to fulfill their net zero claims going forward. That's, I think, a big reform that needs to happen. And we need to develop and align new methodologies for carbon removal project types around things like soil carbon sequestration, CCS, direct air capture, and so on. And last but not least, we will need some alignment between voluntary markets and compliance instruments that are both, I think, looking at this new issue of removals and how that could be tackled. So these are some of the issues and food for thought that I see around removals to set the stage for the presentations to come. And I'll stop here.
Thank you, Patrick. I think you actually did an outstanding job in setting the stage. I will preempt, I know there'll happen, some of the questions coming in. These slides, so not only Patrick's, but all the slides, certainly after getting the blessing of all the speakers, but they will be posted on the virtual Pavilion portal after soon, very soon, and that'll be along with the recording. So, with IETA and ICROA being involved in, nearly as many, maybe as many voluntary market initiatives as South Pole is, you can see how much action is happening, but also so much confusion out there, including around just removals and definitions and understanding. So I think, again, you did a great job, Patrick, setting that stage. And now we're going to get a little deeper into some diverse views around, well, actually starting with Lauren Riley, and on the demand side, that consumer side, and specifically related to airlines, the aviation sector, low carbon, jet fuel, right? So Lauren, I know you don't have any slides here today, but if you could just tell us about what United, is doing, what you're thinking, what you're seeing in the space, how it's evolving, some of those trends, including demands from your own customers, and how you might operationalize some of your climate and net zero commitments over the coming years. Lauren?
Yep, thank you, Katie. And let me start by just acknowledging that, I'm thrilled to be joining this panel today. I think these kinds of conversations about what's next and how do we build it is so critically important right now. So I'm excited to see where this goes. So the aviation industry, commercial aviation in particular, is a carbon intensive industry. We are responsible for about 2% of the global emissions. And we recognize that we need pathways forward to decarbonize. For a long time, United has been a leader in this space, really trying to cultivate a marketplace around alternative fuels. So today we have significant technological limitations with our aircraft, with our fueling infrastructure, with how we are allowed our flight paths through FAA and other. So finding ways to reduce the carbon and reduce the emissions out of our fuels has been a laser focus of United for a very long time. So we have been building a market around sustainable aviation fuels, which is really primarily using a biomass instead of petroleum to really build a market. But the challenge there is that there's not enough supply. You can't scale that at the capacity that's really needed to achieve some of these goals around reducing emissions, certainly if we're going to achieve net zero by 2050. So looking at innovation, looking at next generation, looking at scalable, cost-effective solutions is really, really critical for industries like ours. And it's really exciting to have conversations around the associated oil from a direct air capture or carbon capture process. All of that could be used theoretically today on our aircraft. And it supports sort of the closed loop approach of using carbon. We are getting a lot of interest from our passengers about this issue, for sure. And certainly it's the individual customers that fly, once or twice a year for recreational leisure travel. They want to know, how do we offset? They want to understand, what is the impact of this travel? They're beginning to suggest, does it make sense for me to get on this flight? Which is really interesting because the conversation is becoming a lot more sophisticated and there's a demand for action. From the corporate perspective, we're seeing a whole host of activity where folks, as Patrick pointed out, are really interested in realizing their own corporate goals, which from my point of view is really an exciting position to be, because we can bring the power, the voice, the interest of all of our corporate accounts with our own and all of our network of partners, and we can really drive market-based change to see some of these new low carbon products emerge, which is really what we need right now. So there's a lot of collaboration with our corporate accounts on what does it mean to travel carbon neutral? What does it mean to realize their own goals when they've got some business travel? And I'll acknowledge that there's not a whole lot of business travel right now, but it will return. And when it does, they want to return sustainably and responsibly. And United wants to partner with them to return to service responsibly and sustainably. And so there's a really great alignment going on right now with a multitude of voices in the marketplace to really bring together change. And so this is an exciting time for United, and I look forward to seeing for commercial aviation at large, where these options and these new technologies and innovations take us.
Thanks very much, Lauren. I think I probably speak for a lot of people that even when we were probably traveling a bit too much prior to COVID, we miss it. I think we miss being together, so we want to come back to you, and I know that things will hopefully look better, and it's good to know that there isn't at least the possible waning in that interest, right? If anything, maybe there's even more interest in kind of the climate action and executing on, those commitments for climate sustainability as we even journey through the current COVID challenges. So we will definitely be coming back to you during the moderated discussion, Lauren. Thanks very much, though, for your remarks. And now we have Rob Zeller, and Rob's also based in the US, in Houston, and is actively involved, certainly across the host of technologies, opportunities for Oxy Low Carbon Ventures, and in particular DAC as well, so direct air capture. And so we would love Rob to take the mic and share a few thoughts, really through the US, the Americas lens, around the activities that Oxy Low Carbon Ventures is involved with right now, and specifically related to the technological removals and DAC outlooks and opportunities.
Great. Thank you, Katie, very much. Appreciate that. Next slide, please. So today I want to talk to you about something new, something called low carbon oil or associated oil. And it's called associated oil because it's associated with carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere and permanent sequestration into the geosphere. Well, Oxy Low Carbon Ventures is interested in this part of the solution because this is where we have the most experience and we can have the biggest impact. Please, next slide, please. So from a leadership commitment perspective, this is our CEO, Vicki Hollab. She's committed on addressing climate change, and in fact, in 2018, she formed Oxy Low Carbon Ventures and made it a core business segment. And we're partnering with a lot of folks around the world and industry leaders, technology suppliers, so that we can make an impact as we all strive to a lower carbon intensity of our operations and products. Next slide, please. There's a lot on this slide, but let me just walk through it. Why did we choose as Oxy leading carbon management? First, and you may not know this, but Oxy has over a 40-year track record in storing CO2 safely, reliably, and permanently in the Permian Basin in Texas. And we've been doing that, as and we have accumulated approximately 400 million metric tons over that 40-year time frame. We've collected 45Q tax credits for over 10 years, and we did that through an MRV program. And we're also working with folks around the world on helping them understand the reservoirs underground in their areas and capturing that CO2 and helping people around the world to do carbon sequestration. On the second side of it, I touched on the MRV programs. The United States EPA, we were awarded the first and the second MRV program ever done. We're working very closely with California Air Resources Board on and we had one approved on a carbon intensity reduction pathway, and we're working on the first permanent certification via EOR with CARB. Third, we've invested purposefully to complement our strategy on our businesses, and we'll be talking about one of those investments in a minute, our partnerships. And what we're doing is we're producing something new. Besides just being a carbon management company, we're also producing this low carbon oil, which could be a solution for a lot of these hard to decarbonize industries. So what makes us the world's largest CO2 manager? Today, we sequester about 20 million metric tons per year in the Permian Basin. Most of that is natural CO2, and it's used for economic purposes and enhanced oil recovery. But substituting man-made or anthropogenic CO2 is very logical and something we should do. 4,000 kilometers of CO2 pipelines, 20,000 injection wells, 700 megawatts of compression, 14 gas processing plants, a footprint or an area that's basically larger than New York City, 34 gas processing plants, and we have a potential to sequester 150 billion metric tons of CO2 with the existing infrastructure in place. And if you go below that and you look at saline formations, there's another 1 trillion metric tons per the United States Geological Society. Next, please. So as part of the, what we're envisioning is a carbon neutral energy cycle. We've coupled direct air capture technology from carbon engineering. That CO2 pulled out of the atmosphere, it goes into our existing EOR operations, and we produce a low carbon oil that feeds into the airline, rail, maritime industries. So what we've done is we've combined these different technologies in a different way and hasn't been done before. And as Lauren had said, you want to have say if you're going on your dream vacation and you want to have a low carbon flight, one option is that you can feel good about having a low carbon oil by setting up the circular carbon energy cycle. Why don't you go to the next slide, please? So what we've done is in order to make this carbon neutral energy cycle a reality, we formed a new development company called 1.5, and it's 1.5.com if you want to look at that. We've partnered with Carbon Engineering and in fact got a license from them for the first commercial scale DAC plant in the US. We've partnered with Racine Capital, and all together we've put together what we believe to be the key elements to build a new industry. In Carbon Engineering, we firmly believe that we've secured the best in class industrial scale technology. In Racine, we have a management team that have successfully invested in and commercialized energy and water companies for 20 years. And in Oxy, we are really one of the few companies on Earth that can actually sequester CO2 into the geosphere at scale. We have a tremendous experience and know-how in scaling first-of-a-kind technologies, and we have the project management expertise to bring billion-dollar projects in on what we call on time and on budget. Next slide, please. So in summary, I hope you see that Oxy is striving to be the premier carbon management company for the US and the world. Our new development company, 1.5, is taking our aspirations and making them a reality. Our differentiated low carbon oil product or associated oil could be part of the solution for hard to decarbonize industries. And we are working for it to be recognized in the international carbon trading markets. Our technical advisory services group are helping like-minded partners around the world meet their climate ambitions. So the bottom line is Oxy is moving to be a part of the solution to address climate change.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Rob. I actually had the pleasure during New York Climate Week to be involved in a net zero panel, leadership panel, corporate net zero panel, where your colleague from 1.5 or 0.15, I should say, was there describing the major activity that is occurring with the DAC project and carbon engineering. It's really quite impressive. And I don't think I'm off base by also saying that some news came out yesterday related to Occidental's net zero target, right, by 2040. Yeah. And if you could just do a sanity check, we are expecting more details by the end of this month. Is that right on the plan?
I'm not sure it's the end of the month, but we're going to be publishing our sustainability report that will detail some of that. I think 2040 is really related to Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, and then 2050 is addressing our Scope 3 emissions of the products we produce.
Excellent. We'll certainly watch this space, and it's quite apparent that moving towards those kinds of targets, the area of removals, right, and DAC and the work that you're up to is so critical. So thank you. And in the spirit of global cooperation in this space, and looking at what is happening on the other side of the world, we have Andras from Aqua Power to talk more about similar solutions that are happening, but really through the lens of the Gulf region. So Andras, would you like to take the mic?
Thank you very much for the opportunity, sharing the experience that is significantly different if we compare to Europe or United States, because it is a total opposite. So in the Gulf, we haven't got any carbon price. We haven't got any carbon tax. We haven't got any emissions trading scheme, and also the international mechanism for carbon credit development from CCUS is not available right now. So because of that, the Gulf region is focusing on solution what has economic benefits as a CO2, as a raw material or a technological support material. And because of that, in the last 5-6 years, the Gulf region leading companies, majority oil companies, focusing on point source carbon capture, and they are utilizing that CO2 in the enhance of oil recovery, and that's currently the market, 90% of the market right now. But and we have also big size projects like the Saudi Aramco, the SABIC, and also the ADNOC is working and collecting CO2 and using as an opportunity to create circular economy. What is very forward-looking, and a lot of new developments and also research and development is available in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates as well. And for example, our company, we haven't got any refinery and we haven't got any oil wells, so we cannot use CO2 for that purpose. But we also planning a smaller scale point source CO2 capture, and using the captured CO2 in the water desalination, because it is a very important material for the water desalination. And just to summarize, all this is this market what has so currently in the GCC, we have a proper market for CO2, what can support at least and the current level, the point source carbon capture. What is important, and also mention that there are new opportunities in the future, and also focusing everybody in the oil companies somehow create low carbon jet fuels, what Lauren mentioned, that's important for the jets, and also for let's say United Arab Emirates. In the United Arab Emirates, the aviation is more than 20% of the GDP. So for that country, the low carbon jet fuels is key. So more or less that is the current situation, and we have some opportunities, and also two factors what we have to also mention, that new opportunity with the very low renewable energy prices, what we can see right now in the Gulf region. It is well under the 2 cents per kilowatt hour, but can create more effective and more cost-effective carbon capture, and also we hope that the carbon price will be created based on the promise of the Saudi energy minister 2019, and we hope that could also have the widespread of the carbon capture and storage in the Gulf region.
It's great. It's really interesting, Andras. Thank you. Before I go to Nick, I'll just actually ask you, like, when you think about the U.S. context, and yes, it's very different in many ways, and you look at how, you know, Rob and Oxy Low Carbon Ventures, they were able to move forward with a lot of these like regulatory compliance market drivers and enablers like 45Q, right, and engaging with the California Resources Board and the LCFS. So Andras, without, at least at this stage, right, in late 2020, across, you know, the Gulf region, any of these, well, subnational, but really national regulatory legislative type drivers and these clear market signals, are you expecting to possibly see some of this over the coming, you know, year or two in at least some of the key regions in your area of the world?
It's a good question, but very difficult to answer. But there are signs. There are signs. It's sure. The Saudi government start to collect opportunities and technologies what can create a carbon neutral future for Saudi Arabia. So they are focusing very well on. We don't have any real expectation of the future of the emissions trading scheme, but we can have some internal support mechanisms what can help to create that environment for CCUS technologies. But what is important, they are put a lot of money on it, and also government and government research institutes working on very hard to create CCUS as a viable, economically viable technology in the future.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, Andras. Watch that regional space. I think there's going to be more engagement than ever over the coming years in your neighborhood of the world. So I'll just actually remind people, including if they, well, certainly came in later, the chat box, that is a function. Please start submitting some questions and comments if you have any, and we will reserve some time at the end to get to at least some of those questions and comments before we wrap. But before that, we have one more speaker, like I said before, last but certainly not least, it's Nick from Carbon Finance Labs. So Nick, we have had some great comments, views, starting with Patrick, the broader scene, market trends, removals, looking then at Lauren and airline industry, some of those consumer customer demands, and then certainly Rob and Andras with some how and solutions in Gulf region, in the US. So if you could take it home for us, so at least connect some of the dots, but really focused on what your team is involved with these days and looking at what is some of the key market infrastructures, the tools, right? What can allow us to actually be able, with integrity and confidence, differentiate across these different energy, low carbon energy products going forward. So Nick, over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Katie, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Nick Gogarty. I'm with Carbon Finance Labs, which is a spin out from Oxy Low Carbon Ventures. And our mandate is to try and understand where are the future for products, markets, and marketplaces. And one of the things we're doing to that end and trying to understand a low carbon future is creating a tool that enables and supports some of the efforts you just heard about. And so you've heard a lot about software, energy infrastructure, and toys, I guess the hardware actually of capturing carbon and all the rest. And so to this end, we realized that there's probably some software and infrastructure that's needed for what we perceive to be demand for lower carbon or even low or negative carbon products and services. And right now, the carbon market, the offset market that you're all familiar with, is targeted towards companies, right? Companies buy offsets to mitigate their corporate footprints, maybe do things. But what that means is they're not exactly pointed to products. And we view that as a miss, a huge miss in the voluntary market. And the question is, well, why not? And the problem is that assigning and tracking carbon across a supply chain is a real challenge. So what we're doing is we're developing a tool that allows, what you see here, this presentation, allows carbon intensity to be tracked for products and services, and then also allows that carbon intensity to be potentially mitigated with offsets in a transparent way so that everyone along that supply chain can see where something came from, where it's going, what the journey of process was along the way. And that's a little more complicated than it sounds. It's also, it's not what I'd call the really exciting side of this universe. It's the plumbing, right? It's accounting software under the hood, but it's one of the key enablers so that the long supply chains that go beyond just simple producer supplier, a one handoff, right, with a carbon differentiated product, can emerge. And what we do, and the example we give today internally is, look, you should be able to buy carbon as a consumer, embedded in a product, and it should pass the candy bar test. You should be able to buy one product literally on a shelf by looking at it, buying that product, and you've bought a carbon neutral product, right? If you buy an organic product, that label tells you something about the physical traits of it. If you buy a fair trade product, you probably know some of the social traits of that product in the supply chain. And we want to do the same thing for carbon. So we've developed, next slide, please. There we go. So what we've developed is we're developing a tool called Carbon Sig, which is short for carbon signature. And the thinking is it's going to be a little bit like a DocuSign, where DocuSign for carbon signature of products and services, whereby what you can do is if you're in a supply chain, can track the inherited carbon signature you may have from your upstream products or services, add the carbon intensity of your value add process, and then hand that downstream. The tool allows someone to take, let's say, a raw commodity, water, energy, oil, a fuel, a plastic, and effectively convert what might be seen as a commodity product into a service because it may have the carbon intensity reported. There'll be free access to the tool for the downstream off-taker, as well as the potential to either have a mitigated or reduced product and hand that down. So the idea is to provide a light ecosystem tool to create these differentiated products and services both upstream, and then enable make it very easy for downstream consumers to make those choices. And again, I won't read the slide, you can all read it, but we think it's quite an exciting opportunity to add this bit of information to the product and service. And it's designed as an ecosystem play for any form of mass or energy or service across the system. And to give you an example of how large this is, the candy bar test I mentioned earlier, many of you may be aware that Unilever intends to track and report the carbon intensity on all of their 70,000 SKUs. So that could be the candy bar, the shampoo, etc. We anticipate a market future where consumers can just easily pick that lower carbon product they want. We won't be that brand, we won't be that market, but we'll be a key enabler for that story and narrative. Next slide, please. Go to the next slide. Thank you. And this is just a little mock-up of what that might look like under the hood. The end consumer wouldn't see it unless they wanted to, so it'll be exposed for NGOs, regulators, etc. But literally, you purchase a product and you could see what the carbon intensity of that product is, because right now that's invisible. You can't see what happened to that product and how it got to you from the supply chain perspective. What was the transition and the transformations and the processes that it took to make that product to get to you? So this is just an illustrative example. It's not the actual final workout, but the concept is someone might be able to look at a label and read the entire concatenated chain of the history of the products or services that they're consuming. And what we'll do is we'll provide a framework that basically a little bit like a mortgage. Imagine if you had a house mortgage where you could attach carbon intensity to your house, and then the next person, when they sold your house or they bought it, would attach their carbon intensity, etc., and you concatenate that journey. So that's one of the products that we're developing right now in-house, proof of concept. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Nick. And again, a reminder, after I get the blessing of all the speakers, we will be posting some of the final slides for all participants to access. And actually, maybe before we get into some of the moderated questions, we are starting to see some great questions coming in to the group or privately to me. Nick, I think just quickly, with the risk of putting you on the spot around your product development and the CarbonSig tool, do you have any feel, ballpark even, for timeline-wise as we head through 2021? I know that people are wondering.
Yeah, a friend of mine, a brilliant software engineer, once said, you should never, three things in a career choice in life you should never do. Never work with animals, children, or software. Because they're all very uncertain and temperamental. So I'll hesitate on where we're at. I'll say, we're at the proof of concept. We're going for a minimum viable product, hopefully in the first half of next year. And we're looking for design partners at this stage. So anyone out there who's interested to show up and shape the product and or test that it meets their needs across various sectors. So we're talking to a couple of oil companies, energy companies, etc. But anyone with a product or service, we would like to speak with you and, frankly, more important, listen to you and your thoughts and needs. Excellent. Thank you very much, Nick. Mm-hmm. Sure.
So I think we'll start actually with one of the questions coming in to the group, but it was one that was at the top of my mind anyway, and I actually circle back to Patrick. And it's come in from Gabrielle Walker, a dear friend, and it's around, like, if you had to identify the biggest barrier, the one biggest barrier, okay, from the flowing of capital into these removal solutions at scale, Patrick, what would you say?
Yeah, I think there are a few, but if I had to pick one, it's, I think, an evergreen that we have been debating in IETA pavilions, I think, for 10 years now. I think it's the lack of a carbon price. And I think what we see with many removals, especially on the technological removal side, even where we have cap and trade systems or clear price signals around CO2, the price levels today in these systems are not sufficient to cover the costs of these technologies like direct air capture or even many of the CCS projects. Or even things like soil carbon sequestration are often still too expensive. So that's one problem. Now we have, I think, an opportunity with voluntary markets heating up and corporates making bold net zero commitments. That's creating a new demand for removals. We see here and there also a higher willingness to pay. However, we see a disconnect there where, corporates are going straight for the pure form of removal based on atmospheric CO2 or biogenic CO2. But a lot of the infrastructure that is needed in order to enable low-cost removals in the long run will come from things like CO2 pipelines or CCS and with point source CO2. So I think from like a more academic perspective, if I couldn't, design an ideal policy pathway, I think we would need to incentivize first these industries where the infrastructure and the know-how will come from. And as we saw in the presentation by Rob, the oil and gas is part of the solution for large-scale removals, but they will need the right incentives at the right place in order to get there. And over time, through the technological learning curve, we will be in a position to deliver then the pure form of removals at much lower cost. But I see a bit of a missing gap there where the voluntary market is rejecting CCS based on fossil fuel CO2, and the current compliance schemes, with a few exceptions, like maybe 45Q in the US, is not really incentivizing the infrastructure for removals at the moment. So that's, I think, my one biggest barrier.
Just the physical. That's great. And actually, while I have you, I think it's really quickly. We have seen with the CCS protocol in LCFS, right? We've certainly seen CCS activity protocol market drivers in Alberta, right? But what are you seeing methodological wise, right? So greenhouse gas methodologies, and I guess some of the ripest opportunities that are under development right now in across parts of the world. What is keeping like this, you know, you, the team, your stakeholders, customers, kind of excited, or what are you watching on just the methodologies and standards that are being developed for technological removals?
Yeah, as I said, I think that there is still a gap in terms of methodologies. We need also some coherence around definitions of removals, and that needs to be written into the standards. That's not very clear. We need standards to start distinguishing between traditional carbon credits and removals. But then on a project level, we have, I think, only one methodology approved at the moment under ACR for enhanced oil recovery. And there is a big need now to develop new methodologies for direct air capture, for CO2 mineralization approaches, for there is, I think, was one methodology approved recently under the VCS and CAR for soil carbon. And we know there is a lot in the pipeline. South Pole is also working on quite an extensive pipeline of projects and involved in methodology development at the moment as well. So I think it's in the next 12 months, we'll see actually a lot happening and coming online, driven by this demand and new interest in these technological removal technologies. So it's a matter of time, I think, until we see that happening.
Thank you very much, Patrick. So if we go to, I'd like to go actually back to Rob and Andras with your experiences, and maybe, you know, Rob first. What comes up a lot across different groups is that how do you know that this CO2 permanently remains in the ground? And I know that we could spend an entire day talking about this, but I mean, just your quick, typical, you know, response to that of these, you know, I think very at least authentic or legitimate concerns that will come up when you're talking about these kinds of technologies.
Sure, and there's it all depends on the rock. Meaning, you know, where are you putting that CO2? Now, in enhanced oil recovery, we've been doing that for 40 years, and most of that CO2 that we've been using is a natural CO2, and that natural CO2 is basically you drill a hole in the ground somewhere, you find CO2, and then you transport it via pipelines to the oil field, and that you don't do that for free. That costs money, and so managing and keeping as much CO2 and not losing it, so to speak, is really important from an economic perspective. And so when we use it in enhanced oil recovery, that CO2 actually gets permanently trapped into the rock itself. You can't get it back out. It's our most expensive raw material, and you physically can't get it out of the rock. It's trapped in there by surface tension. It's dissolving into the water. It's dissolving into the very heavy hydrocarbons. It's reacting with calcium and magnesium that's underground, forming rock again. And so that's how it gets permanently trapped underground. It physically can't get removed. And so if I know there's a lot of concern that, you know, what if there's a big earthquake and the earth opens up? Is there going to be a big bubble of CO2 that's going to come out and impact the atmosphere? And physically, that's not possible. In saline aquifer formations, there's been a couple of those where we've injected. We personally have not, but we've studied it, and we're working on our own Class 6 wells, injecting that underground. And what that does is that the plume, they monitor the plume. It dissolves into the water. It reacts with the minerals and forms rock again. And so that I think it's a pretty well established technology. It's not going down into a big empty cavern underground. It's going into a porous sandstone, and it gets trapped in there.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you, Rob. And I guess, you know, another question coming through is in with your projects, what kind of volumes are you expecting to be built out?
Sure. Well, you know, if you look, even if you, and I think Patrick said this, even if you've eliminated every fossil fuel burning and you planted 1 trillion trees, and the natural processes of the earth don't work fast enough in order to keep us below 1.5 degrees. So it's going to take some sort of technology to capture CO2 out of the atmosphere to get it back down. So if you look at from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution to today, there's about 2 trillion metric tons of CO2 that's accumulated in the atmosphere. Our standard, say, offering of a 1 million metric ton per year plant, I think that there's been some studies done that we need to remove about 10 gigatons of CO2 a year. So that's 10,000 of these 1 million metric ton per year plants. And those would have to operate for 200 years in order to remove that accumulated CO2 out there. So each time, you know, you may all have heard of Wright's Law. So we're going to build the first plant and we're going to learn a lot. And when we build a second plant, we're going to reducing the cost, both CapEx and OpEx. And as we continue to go through the different generations and provide innovation, these costs are going to come down substantially more than now, but it just takes someone to do that first one. And so bottom line is the size of the problem is enormous. And so direct air capture seems to be, it almost has to be part of the solution. And we believe that we're positioning ourselves with carbon engineering, which is a very large scale technology that's basically de-risked today, and to implement that, and you could see thousands of these plants built over time, over the next couple of decades.
Right on. Very interesting. Thank you very much, Rob. And Andras, there's some great questions coming in for you, including about the intrigue around the water desalination sector. Do you have any idea about what to expect for the first utilization of CO2 injection in this sector, water desalination, in the Gulf region?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
When you expect the first utilization of CO2 injection in the water desalination sector in the Gulf region?
This is currently a working technology. So we use CO2, just we buy somewhere else the CO2, but it will be the next couple of years until we can get our own CO2 injected in the water desalination. Let's say 2-3 years later on. That's the plan.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. And heading back to Lauren. So with United, obviously you could take a number of different, routes, pathways to support your, decarbonization goals and process at United. But do you have some key, priority pathways, routes that your, team is looking at considering right now? And that could even be including, just the broader ICAO goals or CORSIA, right, opportunities. So any thoughts to just some priority or one priority, big priority hub or pathways that you're currently considering?
Sure. So I like to call it the strategy of and. We need all of it. I mean, right now we don't have enough pathways, and that's part of the challenge that we're talking about. We need sustainable alternative fuels. We need modernization of aircraft. We need modernization of the air traffic control, because there's a lot of efficiencies that can be yielded there. We need carbon capture and sequestration. We need innovation. We need renewable energy. So I can go on and on and on. The point is that we are so early within commercial aviation, within aviation at large, that we don't know which one is going to be the pillar that we lean on the most. I do think it's going to be a multitude. There are also several different approaches to decarbonization across aviation. Offsets is a reality that is facing our industry right now simply by virtue of the fact that there aren't other alternatives that are scalable and cost effective. That's problematic. And then, United has very much taken the approach that we want to lean in and help drive some of these marketplaces around innovation, take those thoughtful risks, really help build the next generation of solutions rather than offsetting and enabling status quo. So being comfortable in that space, being a market leader in that space is something that I expect us to continue to do.
Okay, So I have to ask, I can't help it. US election. There is an election that happened. We all know that we're in for the next, couple of months of maybe some question marks and a bit of a rocky road, but for all intents and purposes, we have now the Biden-Harris transition plan has been posted, including on climate. And so I have to ask, your hot takes, and really you, Lauren, I'll let you go first. And just airlines, United Airline, right? But also Rob, right, being in the US, your prospects around how this changes, or maybe it doesn't, frankly, change kind of the moves, the interest, maybe even, broad bipartisan support on, removals. So Lauren, you first. What should we all leave thinking about the US situation and how at least United or some of those US airlines are thinking about the coming years?
Sure. And thanks, Katie, for this question. So I think it's been really interesting, quite honestly. I mean, over the last 4 years, it has been a market that has been driven by corporations and consumers saying it's time. And now we have an administration that will be stepping in that has really declared very loudly that climate issues are fundamental to some of the policy objectives that it's looking to achieve over the next couple of years. I do think it would have been a bit of a different circumstance if there's certainty in the Senate and it had also gone Democratic and we kind of had a massive flip to Democrats in all components of government. I think that would have accelerated some of these ambitions in a way that we might not see right now. We do have the Biden-Harris administration, but we don't have the Senate, and that remains to be seen. So I think it's going to be a little bit more of a moderate progression, which I'm not worried about, because I think corporates, I think consumers are going to continue to be vocal in their expectations. I do think some things around environmental justice, around infrastructure for electrical vehicles, investment in R&D, which is so critically needed. All of that will happen. I think it's going to be a lot more through partnership with corporates, through partnership with markets to really help drive what the priority areas are. But I do not expect the Biden-Harris administration to back down. I question how much they'll be able to accomplish.
Right on. Well, yeah, exactly. And we'll certainly see what happens with the runoff elections in Georgia in January, right? And whether or not the Democrats actually take the majority in the Senate. But I think some, things that we at IETA at least are pretty much banking on that there will be movement, right? What it looks like, we're not quite sure yet, but around low carbon products, right? And trade and border carbon adjustments. And certainly like a lot of this all kind of nestles into that bucket, right? Of what we're talking about today. So very quick, Rob, and then Nick, I'm going to go to you for some final departing words. Rob, your hot take on where things stand in the U.S. right now and what to watch.
Yeah, very quickly. Certainly, President-elect Biden has stated he's going to rejoin Paris, so that's going to be a change. But I don't, from a policy perspective on promoting CCUS, such as the expansion of 45Q, that actually occurred in 2018 and was signed into law by President Trump, who facilitated a lot of the infrastructure and CCUS projects in the U.S. So when we talk to legislators, it really is a bipartisan priority. They may have different motivators. For example, one has more of an altruistic climate focus, while the other one is interested in protecting jobs in the coal industry or the fossil industry, depending on their constituents. But we're seeing it's a very bipartisan priority for everybody, and we expect it to continue to be that way too.
That's great news. Thank you. Yes, Rob, we'll all be very, very busy in 2021 and beyond. And like I said, Nick, as really a great partner in this and sponsoring this fascinating, like I had said at the beginning, timely discussion, do you have any parting words for the group?
No, only that the conversation around carbon is going to become far more interesting and diverse as more technologies arrive on the place and more actors step in, and those actors are obviously political. You have the Fed putting climate risk in the financial sector. And frankly, it's a very exciting time for a lot of people to work together and collaborate and hopefully come up with great and innovative solutions to a very large problem.
The great discussion. I think very insightful parting words, Nick. Thank you so much. And I'd like all of us to at least virtually provide a round of applause and a big special thanks to all of our speakers here today. And, you know, Patrick, Lauren, Andrash, Rob, Nick, this was great. And like I said, probably we could do this for days on end, but we managed to, I think, squeeze everything, at least at this stage, into an hour. The recording, like I said, the slides, those will all be posted on our Virtual Pavilion website. And I hope that all of you have an opportunity to join some of the other virtual events that are occurring later today and tomorrow. So with that, I'll bid you adieu. Thank you all so much. Stay safe and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you.